Welcome back, Doubts Aloud listeners, both new and old, to this June episode. Today is going to be a perfect show. It's going to have the perfect intro, and it's all about perfection of God. What am I talking about, you say? Well, Ed?
We've got here because we have this sort of background agenda of this book with 50 arguments for God. And, probably a few months ago, the last one we got to was the Dud, which was discussing the Gospel of Thomas. That was a whole chapter on that. So for such an eventuality, I dipped into the internet and got some help on Facebook from some Christians to find some positive arguments for God to add, make the list up to 50. So they're all proper arguments, not just talking about the Gospel of Thomas. This apologist called Peter Freeft, who is a Catholic, and he made a name for himself giving 20 arguments for God's existence. So a lot of those 20 will be repeated in our 50 arguments book, but we've got one here that is on perfection, and it is its own thing. It's not. I've not seen it anywhere else, but it has been recommended to us by the Christian community that we engage with. So it is on perfection, and it's written up by someone who is a Jesuit, or Jesuit college anyway, and he's a proper philosophy person. He's not just some.
It's not an internet warrior.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was written up well before the internet was invented. Anyway, so this was from a book he wrote, I guess, in the 60s or 70s. But we've just used a one-page summary of it from his website. So, because Francis is our philosophy graduate whiz.
Right, yes.
Over to you to try to get your head around what he's saying, and then we'll try and see what we make of it.
Well, having done a bit of research on it, it seems that this is Freeft's attempt to represent, and he's quite open about this, not a secret. He's just trying to, I think, put forward in a more accessible version an argument that he's taken from Aquinas. In fact, I gather that his first 5 arguments are the 5 arguments that are set out in Aquinas's 5 ways of establishing that God exists. So if we look at Aquinas's version, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure what Freeft's done with it that is supposed to be an improvement. This is how Aquinas argues it. Some things are found to be more good, true, noble, etc., and others less so. Well, you can see Freeft going along those lines, because he starts off in this. I think the one that we're using, the version of Freeft's argument, is a very much a sort of shortened version, and I think he probably presents it more fully elsewhere, because he says something very similar. We notice around us things that vary in a certain way. A shade of colour, for example, can be lighter or darker than another. A freshly baked apple pie is hotter than one taken out of the oven an hour ago, etc., etc. So that's so there he's going with that first premise of Aquinas's argument. Some things are found to be more of whatever qualities they have in varying degrees. So the comparative terms describe the varying degrees up to a superlative. So there's good, better, best. So Aquinas moves from there to something. If you look at those things, good, true, noble, that implies that something is the best, truest, or noblest of all things. And then he goes on to say, I'm still using Aquinas, when many things possess some property, the one most fully possessing it causes it in others. So the example that Aquinas uses, and I think that Kreeft also in some of his writings, I can't remember if he's put it here, but the example Aquinas uses is fire is the hottest thing, and so it is fire that causes other things to be hot. So that's the basis of that premise. When many things possess some property, the one that most fully possesses it causes it in other things. So from there we go to, there is something which causes in all other things their goodness or nobility or trueness. And then this is a standard ending for all Aquinas's 5 ways. He says that thing we call God. So it's not, as I say, really clear what Kreeft adds in that, is adding to it. He does have a turn of phrase where he says, if these that degrees of perfection pertain to being, and being is caused in finite creatures. So I think the idea is that limited finite creatures need a cause, so their being needs a cause, and
this is now not perfection, just it's almost this Aquinas-y thing of being and what's it called, pure act.
Well, it is, but they sort of I do find they all tend to overlap, and it is very much central to Kreeft's rephrasing of the argument. The perfection pertain to being, and being is caused in finite creatures. And he goes on to say, but if these degrees of perfection pertain to being, and being is caused in finite creatures, then there must exist a best, a source and real standard of all the perfections that we recognize belonging to us as beings. So that's the argument, and I'm not sure that I can put it any better than that, or steel man it any more than that. I don't know whether at this stage, I mean, that's about as clear as I can make it, that we have these qualities. The qualities exist in varying degrees. We as finite beings must be caused. We cannot be self-causing beings. We cannot be necessary beings, and therefore our qualities that exist in different degrees must also be caused by the best thing, the best of all those, the whatever is the best and the source of all those qualities. If I sound confused, it's because I am.
Yeah. So perfection is one of the qualities that he is picking up on. Maybe it's the most important quality that has degrees of, and that's why we're.
Well, no, I don't think. I think that God, for any quality you can think of, I believe, he is saying that God has it to perfection. So God is what is perfect in any quality, whether it's being true or noble or kind or powerful, or, I mean, God is perfectly powerful and he's perfectly wise, and, think of a quality and God will have it to perfection, which we don't. And I don't think we disagree. We wouldn't disagree with that second part. I don't think we do think that any of us are perfectly wise or perfectly kind or perfectly powerful or any of those things to a perfect degree. But God is the perfect example of all those properties, which I guess Catholics would call great making properties, or those who sort of go down that Thomistic line of reasoning, that these are all great making properties, and God has all the great making properties to an infinite extent, which is what makes him perfect, and we're not perfect. I don't know if you want me now to
Well,
sort of start to talk about what I find so.
Yeah. Somewhere he says if an object has a property to a lesser extent, then there exists some other object that has the property to a maximum possible degree.
You see, this is what I simply don't understand. He seems to me to be saying two different things. That on the one hand, he seems to be saying that we get our idea of what is good by measuring it against a concept of what is perfectly good. And so when we say that one thing is good and another thing is better, we are actually going across in a spectrum in our mind, which leads us to the best thing. And I mean, this is how he puts it in his brief outline that we're linking to. Hang on, I will find it in a moment. We arrange things in terms of more and less. And when we do, we naturally think of them on a scale approaching most and least. For instance, we think of the lighter as approaching the brightness of pure white and the darker as approaching the opacity of pitch black. So when he says that, that seems to be an indication that we have this in our mind, this idea of something that has any quality that we grade to its ultimate extent, and that is what enables us to grade these qualities. But well, for one thing, I just don't agree with that. I mean, I don't think we do. I don't.
Some things are white and black, on and off, but a lot of things are on scales that don't have an end.
Well, and also, when I'm saying one thing is whiter than another, I'm not thinking of the pure whiteness of light. I mean, I'm just looking at two actual concrete things and noticing that one is whiter than the other. I don't have to have in my mind some extreme end of the scale against which I'm measuring both the others. I'm just looking at those two things and measuring them against each other. I mean, I can imagine thinking that one thing is the whitest thing it could possibly be, and then being shown something that's even whiter. You know, and it's not that I need to have in my mind some extreme of white, that everything else that's not quite that white, I'm measuring it against. I just don't see where he gets that idea from, or how it works with what seems to be his other idea.
I mean, it's an idea you can have, but you can't then say that is a premise that goes into a logical argument, because it's just patently not universally true.
Well, I guess I'd agree with that, but I mean, I just find it hard to understand why he is saying that we do even think of it in this way. I mean, I don't think of it in that way. I don't have in my mind some ultimate white thing against which I measure everything else.
Yeah.
I look at actual objects in the world and compare them to one another. And this idea that I've got to have some sort of Platonic vision of complete whiteness, and that I need as my ultimate source and measure is just not certainly not the way I operate, and I think it's not the way anybody operates.
No, but okay. So how about if we ditch all this white and apple pie heat and all the rest of it, and just go for perfection? Is that something that it cries out to have an ultimate end of?
Well, I
think
think
spectrum.
I suppose I'd like to go into what seems to be the other point that perhaps he's making, which is about it not being the ultimate measure so much as the source. So, I mean, those two things seem to be rather different, and I'm not quite sure how he's managing to bundle them up in a single premise. So,
can we keep to what we've been talking about ultimate degrees, and then move on to the source thing second, so we can put to bed the idea that there must be some ultimately perfect being.
Okay. Well. Okay. What do you want to say about that then?
Well, I suppose I'd sit back and cross my arms and say, demonstrate it, please. It's a claim that we understand there's perfection and degrees of perfection. We can also notice that the word perfection has implicit in it the ultimate end of the spectrum. You can't get more perfect than perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But still, these are just talking about words. Is there something in reality that must be absolutely perfect just by understanding there's a scale of perfection? Well, scale of goodness of which perfection is the upper bound.
Yes, I don't see how you get there from it. I mean,
I can't either. So maybe if our listeners could send us an email.
Yes, answers on a postcard, please.
Yes, explaining what we're missing here.
Back in the day when there were such things as postcards.
Okay, so we can park that aspect of it and go on to what you have been alluding to a lot, and that is that there must be a source of it, which is God.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to be like a standalone point, and yet somehow it seems at the same time he seems to want to wrap it up with this degrees of perfection, although I don't see how it belongs to the degrees of perfection. But he's saying that, for instance, fire, things that are hot derive their heat from fire because that's the hottest thing. I mean, that's how Aquinas put it, and Freeft sort of alludes to it by his reference to a hot apple pie out of the oven. But again,
science is sort of a rather.
I was going to say
analogy.
I'm not a scientist, so I do try and steer clear of scientific claims. But even I, as a non-scientist, would say, well, fire isn't the hottest thing. And you can have one fire that's hotter than another fire, and the less hot fire doesn't get its heat from the hotter fire. It gets its heat, as I understand it, from the fuel that you put in it, and the fuel isn't hot at all. So the fire derives its heat from something that isn't hot. So it just seems like
I was thinking of it in another way, and that is that fire is a chemical reaction, and you get a hotter heat from a nuclear reaction.
Right.
And nuclear reaction and a chemical reaction isn't a subset of a nuclear reaction. They're just different things. So the ultimate hotter heat, like the sun, is
you've out-scienced me already.
Yeah. So anyway, if it's a good philosophical argument, then having an analogy that falls apart with subsequent science, I think is nitpicky rather than anything else.
Well, but I just don't see, if you don't think that the source of tallness is the tallest thing, it isn't the tallest thing that makes other tall things tall. Where does it just seems that the argument breaks down because it's like two trains traveling on two completely different tracks, and they're never going to meet. And yet we're supposed to treat them as if they were a single train taking us all in the same direction. I just can't see how they are. It just makes no sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're left with what I imagine is probably another Aquinas argument about God being the source of being, and the goodness and perfection is just one aspect of God being the source of everything.
Yes, I mean, I always think that all these arguments, they do tend to kind of all meld into one, I'm not really sure how. I mean, this seems to me just to be full of doubtful of premises that there's no reason we should agree with, and also full of terms that are not clear. What does it mean to say that degrees of perfection pertain to being? I mean, what does that expression mean? That degrees of perfection pertain to being, and what does it mean to say that being is caused in finite creatures? I mean, I suppose he's saying that God is the cause of everything that's finite, and everything apart from God is finite. But it seems to be full of premises that use unclear terminology, that are open to challenge. I don't see that why this would persuade anyone. In fact, I'm sure it does. I mean, I think this is we were talking before we went on air about Alex O'Connor and his debate with Jonathan McLatchie, and how he was saying that people aren't persuaded by evidence. Well, I'm sure that people also aren't persuaded to believe in God through logical arguments. I just do not believe that anybody ever read any of these arguments and thought, oh yeah, wow, the ontological argument. Well, now I believe in God. I always think that they are a way of a kind of showing off, so that people can sound clever about and sort of put together some very ingenious word game. But that's all it is. All you've got at the end of the day is a word game. I don't know, Ed, whether you want to deal with Kreeft's like little bit at the end where he says, well, what about this objection? And then depending on your way of looking at it, he either knocks it out of the park or he falls flat on his face. I don't know.
Okay, I'd like to, because I was struck by it.
Yes.
And I put a lot of work trying to understand what he was saying. So his objection, so this is the kind of words of the naysayer to his argument, saying this argument assumes a real better, but aren't all our judgments of comparative value merely subjective? So I think I understand the objection, that when everything's all subjective, then how can you have an ultimate, and therefore there's nothing, the argument doesn't go anywhere. And his reply to this objection is, the very asking of this question answers it. For the questioner would not have asked it unless he or she really thought it really better to do so than not. That it's better to ask the question than not. And really better to find the true answer than not. You can't speak subjectivism. So you can speak subjectivism, but you cannot live it. So what I got that he was saying in the end was that just somebody asking that question, they have to have in mind an objective better and not better to ask it. So in asking the questions, aren't all our judgments merely subjective? If you're expecting an answer to that question, you're somehow expecting things to be objective. And I don't think that is the case.
No, I agree, and I'm not a subjectivist. I do think there are not everything that you say is better than something else is objectively true, but I think there are standards by which you can judge things objectively to be better or worse. But leaving that aside, I mean, this just isn't a good response to the question asked, because the person asking it would just say, well, no, I don't objectively think that it's better. It's just happens to be my preference. It's my own personal desire that I would like an answer. And it's not that I think it's objectively better to have an answer. I personally would like an answer.
Yes.
And, even for an objectivist like myself, that's a perfectly adequate comeback to Peter Freeft's attempted, attempt to show up the futility of that objection. I mean, I just don't think. I think that's complete misfire on his part.
I think that the best way I can put it is that if it's true or not that things are subjective, that can't be a subjective answer. It's either true or not that things are subjective, or this particular issue is subjective. So if it isn't, if it's objective, then there is objectivity somewhere in the world, because you put this in the category of objective versus subjective. So you've come to an answer. You could say everything is so completely subjective that it's my subjective judgment that this is a subjective area. But then I suppose we're left with such a mishmash of subjectivity, we can't make any claims at all, which is what some people think.
I suppose it is what some people think. But I just think he's sort of misplaying that card.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, okay, we'll move on, because we want to have Andrew's voice a little bit more and get away from all this pure philosophy. So when I read all this, I thought, hang on a minute, this isn't really a good place for apologists to go. It's opening a whole can of worms, talking about God's perfection, that we know there's a God because we know there's perfection. So let's kind of just put all that on one side and just think about the idea of God being perfect. And it is an idea that an awful lot of theists have. And so if we take the idea that God is perfect, would a perfect God create a perfect world? That is quite an important question. And then the other question that goes with it is this world perfect? So that's what I'd like us to chat about for probably the rest of the show.
Well, Andrew, any thoughts from you?
Well, we've touched into this very point that I'm going to make probably inadvertently many times in this whole podcast series. 53 episodes now. Gosh.
Yeah.
But many times you've touched into this idea of what I like to use Peter Enns' idea. Be careful what you wish for if you want to be biblical. And I love that. I really do. I think that's great because the evangelical world and the fundamentalist world is like, we've got to be biblical. It doesn't really matter what we think in our personal rationality and will and what we want to be true in that sense. We've got to be biblical, and we'll go. And then when you are biblical, we tend to run into problems because we tend to run in what can only be understood, certainly from a skeptical point of view, as an evolution of God, where God doesn't seem to fit the categories that we're talking about. So this whole perfection business seems to be a logical, philosophical outworking of what God must be based on certain ideas that we have. Well, we've talked about it before. God must know the future because that's what gods do, for example. But hold your horses there. There's Bible texts that imply that Yahweh doesn't know stuff, and you're thinking, that's just a way of speaking.
That's the open theism
that's the open theism way, who's wanting to be more biblical and willing to go there. And actually, they're not doing a bad thing, because in my view, it is a different view of God that's presented in certain parts of the Bible. And therefore, this Greek, what would be argued as a Greek idea of perfectionism, that God is wholly other and wholly transcendent and all this business, is really later. It's probably starting in the Bible later, but also in church history, and then growing and growing all the time, and taking ideas from Greek philosophical thought that got merged, probably even at the time of Daniel, even maybe, but certainly afterwards, and so that's the problem we have. We have then texts that we now need to say, oh right, we want to be biblical, but actually we want to fit our biblical text into our theological framework, and there lies the problem. And it's like, which one are you going to do? Are you going to fit the Bible to your theological presuppositions, which you've got from somewhere? When you don't find that they're in the Bible clearly, you think, Okay, so well, we've got them from these verses, but not these verses, and so we'll make it all work. And that's what really tends to happen. So,
right. So, do you think somebody could make a case that the Bible claims God is perfect?
Well, you might take some verses, and maybe the way the New Testament speaks of God, that might fit that category better. But
well, doesn't Jesus say God is perfect? He says you must be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect.
That's true. But then people have struggled over that. How do we be perfect? And so is that perfect in your motive, perfect in your be perfect as your Father's perfect? It's a good point. I mean, that's if you want to be biblical, that's the phrase. But then what does that mean? If we are to be perfect, how would that? Can a finite being be, back to the question again, philosophically, you can say, oh, that implies that a finite being can be perfect then, as your Father is perfect.
Well, so, I guess, I obviously theology or dogma isn't my area, but I always assumed that certainly the more evangelical wing of Christianity would say, basically, Jesus is setting you up to fail. You can't be perfect. So he's instructing you to be perfect. You can't be perfect. And that proves to you that you need Jesus to make you perfect through your relationship with him, because you cannot by your own endeavors.
The problem is with that is that Jesus himself said it to the people around him. And I suppose you would say that's very much what you just said there, Franz, is very much like why do you call me good? Only God is good. Of course, behind that is, behind this is what I was taught years ago about that verse, for example. It's like, oh, well, Jesus doesn't seem to imply that he's God there, because why you call me good? Only God is good. Whereas the evangelical answer is that, but if you thought I was good, you'd be on the right track because I'm God. You know what I mean? So that's a bit like this perfection. It's like you've already written in later gospel understandings to that. Jesus just said, be perfect as your Father is perfect. By the way, you can't be perfect, and so you'll need my salvation because you're a sinner, and so there's all kinds of ways. This is the thing. People fit the text to their current understanding of theology, and this happens all the time everywhere. But Ed, don't you think this touches into our conversation last time off air, where I mentioned to you about a verse that I remember? And then you got all excited about it because I didn't know if it was there. I was starting to doubt whether it was there, and it was. And yet I'd been quoting to people ages about this verse that really shocked me about 10, 12 years ago, when I sort of really took it on board. And do you think that's quite relevant?
What's the verse?
It is good
fun.
What's
the verse, Andrew?
Here, Ed's going to give it.
Okay. It was
it was Exodus 30.
It was, Exodus 32, wasn't it?
Yeah. And this was a verse that I thought came to mind on this idea of the perfect. Just imagine someone saying, God is perfect. God is this, God is that, God is the other. He's the holy transcendent being. And he's, we're the finite, imperfect beings and everything else. And then you read this about the God that you're actually trying to argue for. Go on then, Ed.
Oh, well,
got to find it.
Here. I've got the thing up. It's
start from Genesis and stop when you get to it. All right.
Okay.
It's all around the golden calf period, yeah.
Yes. So now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I'll make you into a great nation. That's God speaking to Moses. And then Moses calms him down. A few verses later, then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. And then...
a bit further on was the one I was
further
really
on. So that's sort of background.
But it's the same idea, yeah.
Maybe it's the next.
I mean, Ed was quite shocked. Again, it's one of these verses. I love to shock Ed by what's in the Bible when you want to be biblical.
Okay, I think here we go. Right. Next chapter. Then the Lord said to Moses, leave this place, you and your people you brought out of Egypt, and go to the promised land, drive out the Canaanites and all Hivites and all the rest of them. Go up to the land flowing milk and honey. Right. But I will not go with you because you are stiff-necked people and I might destroy you on the way. So God has been to anger management classes.
Yes, that's what we thought. So basically,
from helped by Moses, because Moses had to calm him down the first time, and then maybe he realised that he had this anger.
And there's
problem.
another verse that expands on it in more detail, isn't there? I think.
When the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn. Lord said to Moses, "Tell you, are stiff-necked people. If I were to go with you, even for a moment, I might destroy you."
So the idea there is that, and I said that actually that's like God is, yes, it's like anger management classes, that he's learned something there. He's going, listen, I'm not going to go with you because you're such an annoying bunch of people. I might actually just turn and destroy you. So actually, for your own preservation.
Yes, that's right. In an anger management class, you learn the circumstances.
You learn the circumstances. So
you kick off and you learn to avoid them.
He's learning that
avoid
they
the
might,
circumstances,
so to speak, piss him off so much that he'll destroy them. So he's actually saying, look, I won't go with you because you know what I'm like. and this is the God. This is the, I'm just saying, this is really, be careful, as what Peter N said, be careful when you want to be biblical, because that's what the text says. And okay, this is where people now start to say, well, it can mean 100 different things, but we start with what the text says. It gives the impression that the writer thought that God was a bit volatile and he was being a bit wise here by not going. Now, Francis, not necessarily assuming you knew that verse was there, what do you think about the way that verse is written about God, who is this apparently perfect being?
Well, I certainly didn't know the verse was there. It reminds me of my husband's reaction when the dogs managed to steal the strawberries we were going to have for tea off the counter in the kitchen. He chucked them out and said they could stay out there for the rest of the night, as far as he was concerned, and was deaf to their pleading wails as they stuck their heads through the cat flap alternately.
It's like, I mean, it's true.
Are you saying your husband isn't perfect? Is that what you're saying?
Oh no, I'm saying my husband's just like God. My husband's like
how about that
in our household.
So it sounds to me that this text is putting God in the category of very human-like behavior, even if it is this super being. But it's certainly not this divine Greek thought of God as the other. This is actually very similar to the Greek mythical gods, which we've already established, I think, that they didn't actually think existed in that way. And therefore, I suppose somebody's going to say that, isn't it? That this God in the Bible doesn't exist in the way that he's spoken about. But the fact is, that's what we have. We don't, we have at least God so many times spoken of in this very earthly human way. Which is not unlike in the Garden of Eden. Where were you? We went off, came back. The impression is he didn't know. The idea, of course, Christianity.
Well, can we get on to the Garden of Eden?
Oh, okay, certainly, yeah.
Well, I think it's quite important for this whole perfection thing.
Yeah,
because when I set things up in front of a Christian and say, would a perfect God create a perfect world? Question 1. Question 2, is this world perfect? They would say, yes, of course God made the world perfect, and human sin messed it up. And that is either the meaning of or actually described in Genesis 1-3. God making it all perfect or very good is the actual word used in Genesis 1. And by the time we got to Genesis 3, it's all gone belly up.
Yeah.
So Francis.
Well, why humans wouldn't have sinned if they'd been perfect. So how could God have made humans perfect? And yet they sinned. Making a decision to sin is not consistent with being perfect.
Because God himself could make a decision to sin, if it is.
So is it an imperfect world to have people in it who can't sin? They're so restrained that it's impossible for them to sin.
You get into this, another philosophical debate about free will and what is free will, and if you are made with a particular nature by God, is that an imposition on your free will? I don't know. Perhaps you wanted Andrew to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say we're back to the problem again of reading back philosophical ideas of God in his perfection. You know, the classic omnis, omnipresent, omnipowerful, omnipotent. Okay, they're the classic evolved language, which you don't actually find in the Bible in any, certainly those words you don't. But even if you were to take some of the verses in the Bible that might imply that, they're also used in ways that, you know, like there's a verse that says God knows all things, and it says, but John also says, you know, and you know all things. So you're thinking, okay, well, what does that mean? So I think when we read back into Genesis, like as Ed, you were doing, you might have been already slipping into the evangelical way that God did make the world perfect, where actually the writer probably didn't think he did. By using the word good.
I think almost any I suppose apologists tend to be either Catholics or evangelicals, don't they?
Sorry, say that again.
I don't know. Do Christians come in other flavors apart from, or is
yes,
it
you have
binary?
It's million flavors.
Yeah, kind of wishy-washy Methodisty Christian who's completely chilled with gay marriage in church, and
I could just imagine that, Ed.
So you're saying that they
are not
be
going to be into
apologists.
Apologetics,
right? Okay, yeah, I get your meaning.
So apologetics to me tends to be either Catholic or evangelical.
Okay,
I could just imagine Ed having a conversation with saying, "Oh, are you a Christian too?" Yeah, I'm a Christian too. What sort of Christian you? Oh, I'm a wishy-washy liberal. Can you just?
Yeah, they were terrible lot.
I know they're terrible.
Like your friend Steve.
What are you? I'm a diehard fundamentalist, and I, don't approve of gay behaviour. That's right.
I think I call myself a happy clappy when I was in the right circles.
But oh, so the
okay. So what I was suggesting was that it is universal. Both Catholics and evangelicals do go for this Adam and Eve thing. We've discussed that in our Adam and Eve episode a long time ago. So it'd only be the people who aren't in those two categories would tend to dismiss Adam and Eve as telling a story that not telling history.
Yeah, or some sort of hybrid version. That goes through. But yes, you can't. There's very few people. Well, it's not nobody, but there's very few people that say there was no sort of Adam and Eve. But I think it's probably a growing in some quarters, but it's still fraction. And
but still, even as a story, if it's a story, it can still, the meaning of the story that didn't happen is that God made the world perfect and humans messed it up. So
but I would say that there's even a split there. Again, that's the traditional assumptions, but some people, people that have really looked into this aspect go back to as far as Irenaeus, which would be late 2nd century, and he didn't think the world was made perfect. He thought the world was, from my understanding of Irenaeus, that he made the world good, and it was the job of men and with God who didn't fall to make it perfect somehow. I don't know, that's the theology, and the reason for that is, in fact, the text says good, not perfect, and there's other words apparently that could have been used, and another argument is that when they went into Israel, they went into a good land. That's the same word apparently, and so that good land had thistles and thorns and problems and issues, and so it was a good land, and so a good world. And then, of course, we have touched into this before, that some people today argue that the Garden of Eden was very different to the outside world. That the Garden.
So I think I was hoping you'd go there and talk about all the hints in the Genesis 1 and 2 before the fall.
Yes,
that the world wasn't made perfect.
Yes, I think it's basically it's interpretative possibilities that aren't so hard and fast, and this touches into the clash between young earth creationism and other forms of creationism, like young earth creationism are the only group that think that animals didn't die, so the world was made with humans that didn't die, animals that didn't die. And then Adam did something. And then from then on, Adam died and all animals die. Now, the problem is with that is, again, when you're going back to be biblical and you just read the text, there are ways of reading, natural ways of reading that don't fit with that. For example, Adam was brought to the tree of life so that he could live forever. And then he was expelled from the tree of life so that they couldn't live forever. And so that's got nothing to do with the animal kingdom in terms of reading the story. So the argument there is, as say, even Jonathan McLatchie would say this, is that I believe anyway, and people like the progressive sort of old earth creationists they would say that mankind was mortal by creation, subject in fact to potential death, but God made a garden, brought the man and the woman to a tree, whatever that meant. Eating of that would make them live forever like the gods. And so that means then that in fact the world was made with death. That was the creation, but the tree of life was something to completely lift them out of that. And being banned from and thrown out of the garden to the access of that means that you join the rest of natural creation. So I think that's a very natural way of reading the text. And so you don't have to go the way of animals would have lived forever. Plus the fact that animals living forever is just crazy. The world would fill up before you know it with piled high animals.
Yes.
You know, so even reading text literally can actually take you down different paths.
There's a couple of other things that come to mind, and you've probably got some more in your mind. Yep. One is, of course, the snake.
Yes.
It doesn't appear to be perfect, whatever the snake is.
Yes.
A questioning God and that sort of thing.
Yep.
And another is the curse on Eve is that I will greatly increase your pain or I'll multiply your pain in childbirth.
Means there was pain.
There was already pain
in
childbirth. So there's probably others, and I was hoping you'd remember a few.
Yeah,
You said the most important one already.
Yeah, the death was natural by creation, which is something that. But then you see, here's where the nub of the debate is. People go to the New Testament and then read back into Genesis that perhaps the original author had no idea that was going to happen. For example, the serpent being Satan, whereas the serpent is what it says is one of the craftiest creatures that God had made. And the New Testament doesn't even say it explicit. Well, it does actually. There's a person, I think in Corinthians, it talks about the evil serpent may be linked to Satan there, but prior to that, in Jewish thought, they never really made much of that story. They never really talked about a fall. That's later. If you notice, it doesn't say this was a fall. It's just basically they did something apparently that God said you shouldn't do. And even then, it's more complicated because, again, if you read, this is the biggest thing. I think we mentioned this once before. If you read the text straightforwardly, who was telling the truth? It's the serpent was telling the truth of what even the narrator agrees with the serpent. The serpent says, you will not die, but you will live forever, or something like that. And then basically the narrator then goes on to say, oh, they've taken from the tree of knowledge, good or evil. Oh, better remove them from the tree of life in case they live forever. That's what the serpent was basically saying. And they didn't die straight away. In the day that you eat, you shall die. So therefore it's spiritualized by later theology. And so taking the text on its own and being biblical doesn't give you the later theology. Later theology has to go back and say, well, it's spiritual death, and physical death and all the rest of it. But you were asking for hints of outside the garden.
Yes, it's generally that the world God had made wasn't a perfect world.
Yeah, I think,
and so all this having to have a garden to protect you from the outside world suggests that the outside world isn't perfect.
But remember, in this particular story, the Adam was used to till and look after the garden, and God came to walk in the garden, whatever that means. And if we go into one of our podcasts in the future, which will be about the embodied God, that's another whole story that this Genesis will pick up on. But God is walking in the garden, which is being sort of looked after and cared for by, and it does seem to be without thorns and thistles, and does seem to be without strife. But when they're cast out and banished, and there's this angel with a sword going each way to stop them going back in, the implication to me is, in fact, that they're in more of a rough terrain, and now thorns and thistles will grow for you. Not that they make them happen, that God suddenly says, I'm now going to make thorns appear and thistles. It's just literally a description of what does happen in this rough terrain outside. And now you're not going to get water so easily. You're going to struggle to work. It's not idyllic. They were in an ideal paradise, and they're thrown out to what? A non-ideal paradise. So this was never something that I was aware of back in the day when the idea was the Garden of Eden was almost the whole world. Not a isolated spot in the writer's mind, but he talks about it like it's with these known rivers, or at least two of them are known. So I take it much more sort of in this blend of mythical and historical understanding in the writer's mind. And it's not a perfect world. It is a good place. The world is good, but not perfect. And maybe the garden was perfect, but the world was good. How about that? So I think that's a fair place to. If people wanted to go to that kind of argument for refuge, I'd say there's something to it.
Yes, but we're talking about God's perfection here, and you had to ditch it to make that.
Well, yes, you haven't got a perfect world that He made.
Yes. God might be perfect, but He's chosen somehow to make it an imperfect world.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you do that, but we'll get onto that in a bit. I want to sort of put the whole thing to bed. Of course, even if you go for this evangelical Christian understanding of Genesis 1-3, which our friend Justin Brierley uses a lot. You remember he did a video response to Stephen Fry.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Stephen Fry sounding off on Irish TV, which everyone thought was either great fun and terrible, or great fun and brilliant. And anyway, it was such an internet meme thing that Justin did a response video, and basically this is the only place he went, and that is that the all that awfulness that Stephen Fry was picking up with these worms that eat through people's eyes and children dying young and everything, was because of the Garden of Eden story that God made us perfect, and it all went imperfect. The whole of nature went imperfect because of human sin. And turning to the science, you just can't say that unless you're the full-on fundy young Earth creationist. That's your only place you've got to go.
Yeah.
Because we've got all these fossil records that maybe God made things bit by bit. This is not about evolution. This is just a fossil record showing that with dating millennia and more before humans appeared, nature was ready tooth and claw, chomping into its earth with parasites and predation and the full works. So it has to be that God made it in a week, and the next week it all went to hell in a handcart because of Adam and Eve sinned. That's the only way you can go, and that the flood is the cause of the fossil record.
Yeah, but you could even then, even if you took young Earth creationism, you can still make it a problem with a perfect God, because what kind of God makes? I mean, that's like the way I'd parallel this, being a movie kind of guy, is the Death Star in Star Wars. It's this wonderful thing. It's got this hole that goes right to the center, and you can it's a big weakness. So if God is so perfect and makes the world that it is capable of going wrong within a week, I would say that that's a problem. It's like, okay, so it's either a deliberately created flaw, and if you like, maybe free will is that flaw, but that he must have think it was worth it. If it is down to absolute freedom, you can't be a Calvinist here, of course, in our sense anyway. But yeah, so even the young Earth problem is problematic.
I thought most Christians did say that when God made the world, He fully foresaw that there would be a fall, and He had already planned
the salvation route.
Jesus. He'd already planned salvation, so He sort of had the whole thing already mapped out.
Which was part of His, then they'd have to say, His perfect plan. Whether you've ordained it or foreseen it, and you go the Armenian Calvinistic route. The fact is, Adam and Eve, it was a foregone conclusion, put it that way, in reality, that it would all be messed up within, well, young Earth time, a 1 week. I mean, what kind of situation is that to go wrong in 1 week? And under God's knowledge, and at minimum under God's knowledge, it's like the reaction to Adam's sin, like we said, makes the sea creatures eat each other and makes death come in, and all these creatures that you were talking about on that show. And
that's ridiculous.
So that's,
if that was built into the system that God created, that all you need is one person to eat an apple and you've all this terrible
that's the Death Star problem. It's like one apple eaten and I will make plate tectonics. And it's like everything's in place, ready for the fall, by the way. That's almost like it's like it, isn't it? It's like, oh, you take that and it's everything will then go to pot. That is worse, I think, than trying to see the whole of evolutionary history. As one theologian told me, it's not evil, it's nasty, but don't make a moral judgment of something that's nasty. And I thought, that's an interesting angle. So evolutionary history is simply nasty from our tastes, but it's not necessarily a moral evil. And I thought, that surprised me. But it's part of God's...
So that was that was a theological response.
I was in a lecture with him. He's a very well-known guy. This is like an Oxford type guy, Cambridge kind of guy, a theologian, top British one, really big name. But he debated Richard Dawkins once on TV.
All right.
Oh dear, the name will come to me. But I was sitting in the lecture with him, and I actually asked him this question. You'll know the name when I remember it. And I said about this argument that you
not
were talking
Lennox.
About. No, not Lennox. No. He's really, really big in theologian, but he's also a scientist background. And oh gosh, it'll come to me at the end, and I'll have a
Polkinghorne.
No, not Polkinghorne, but of that ilk. And he's basically an apologist as well as a theologian, as well as a science guy. Mainly a theologian, though. Mainly known
not
as
McGrath.
Yes, Alistair McGrath.
Oh, him.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I asked him point blank about this stuff, about the worms eating through and everything else. This was probably about 12 years ago. I had a lecture up in the city. I went with a friend, and he said, yes, I can understand your point of view, but that's just something that's not what we perceive as nasty. That's not necessarily evil or wrong or bad of God. And I thought, it sort of threw me for a minute. We tend to react against these things like that predation is like bad or evil, put immoral to it, when rather it's just nasty and horrible.
I'm rather surprised he would say that, because the problem of evil is not entirely about moral evil. When you talk about the problem of evil, you are talking about in part about moral evil, but you're also talking about evil in the sense of stuff that's nasty stuff is evil. There's
pain and suffering.
Pain and suffering. There's not necessarily a moral aspect to it. So it's when in the context of the problem of evil, when philosophers talk about the evil of pain and suffering, they're talking about it in the same sense that we might use the word when we say that something was the lesser of two evils. I had to make a choice between, I don't know, either, sort of missing the cup final or, missing my daughter's wedding, and then the lesser of the two evils was to miss
it'd have to be the wedding,
or miss the yes, that's right, or the wedding, you've got to make a choice between either you're going to get gangrene going up your leg and eventually killing you, or you lose your leg. That's nasty to lose your leg. And that is an evil, but it's the lesser of two evils. But it's nothing to do with morality. It's nothing to do with saying that this is wicked or that somebody is morally culpable for it. It's just saying this is nasty stuff.
Yes,
yes.
You have to accept that God made the world with nasty stuff that seems to be normal,
that's right.
And it's not to do with a fall. Yeah,
but they have to say that a child dying in agony of cancer,
and
knowing it was coming, is not evil.
That's what they would have to say.
Yes, but an adult striking a child for no reason is evil.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas you could then philosophically go back to say, hang around, if when a building crashes, they go back to the founder of the structural engineers that made it, and they go back to hey, you built this with a flaw in it, like the Grenfell Tower over here in England that burnt down. It had this cladding that was a bad decision on some so people go back to that and say you can't make it like that anymore, and who made the decision. So it's a bit like that with God. You could say that the child dying of cancer, God made a world in such a way that could happen, regardless of whether he said or determined that it would happen. He made it so that it could happen as a potential reality out there, or animals getting caught in a forest fire. This is the natural world that God made. And so the other point I was going to bring up is that actually there's a whole strand of Christianity that wants to see God as easing suffering and healing. There's the whole healing ministry. And this is what you would have been part of, Ed, that God is seeking to heal, presumably against the world that he made to do it like that. Yeah. So I suppose in your view, cancer came from what? Nature, normal God creation.
True.
You haven't thought it through, but obviously,
there are two big schools of thought here, aren't there?
Yeah, opposing. Yeah,
again in the evangelical circles.
Yeah.
If there's a sort of spiritual warfare view, in which case God weeps with the person suffering.
Yeah,
and it's all part of the spiritual warfare. That God somehow can't click his fingers and finish it. Has to sort of let its way through.
Yeah,
and then the other school is God's in control of everything. Yeah, and he kind of pretends to weep.
Yes,
but actually he's caused it.
Yes,
and so we've kind of done a lot on the second half, but not the first half. The first option, which is that somehow God made the world, but he puts the devil in it for some reason, and that somehow isn't his fault, and it's all the devil's fault.
Yeah, but again, he's the source of life even for the devil. And so moment by moment as well, theologically. Yeah. If all things, as I think one of the verses in the Acts says, all things exist because of him, in him, what's the word? In him
we live and move and have our being.
Exactly. So,
right, okay.
So that's it. That's brilliant. Well done, a biblical scholar here.
That's I don't know.
In him,
in one of the
we
letters
live
of Paul.
and move and have our being. Presumably, that's the same for the so-called angelic race, and if that's where Satan came from, or the devil in the evil. Actually, he's maintaining the devil's life and existence moment by moment by moment to do his stuff. So even if the devil is doing everything God doesn't want to do, God is still actually holding his being and allowing it.
Yeah.
So this problem goes right the way back to God in the end.
Yeah.
So just because all the creatures are doing everything that their free will or so-called can do, God maintains it. It's an everlasting maintenance job, and that causes me a lot of problems theologically when I used to think about it.
Okay, so I think what we've done is we've set up the problem. Would a perfect God create a perfect world? Is the world perfect? And the main Christian response is, well, God did make a perfect world and it's us that's messed it up. So I think we've kind of covered the God, we've messed it up option. So we're left with either the world being perfect, which we sort of think it isn't. So it must, if God is real, God either isn't perfect or for some reason a perfect God doesn't make a perfect world.
Well, my suggestion is that the Old Testament writers did not have this perfection view of God. So they didn't have, if you pose the question to them, they don't know what you're talking, they'd have a blank stare. And they'd say, look, we've described God as being volatile. He doesn't want to go with the Israelites in case he destroys them. So Moses seems to calm him down from saying, I'm going to destroy everyone. It's to start from you. Moses goes, hey, hang around, listen to what you said you're going to do. These texts don't face value meaning fit with any of this stuff. So my assumption would be perhaps the writers didn't get to the Greek thought yet. And that's why it makes most sense of the passages, I would say, until we get to later on in history. And so, that's where the problem comes later, not God.
Yes.
God then is not perfect in them.
I can't see how a God being perfect creates an imperfect world.
Yeah. But an imperfect God.
That bit I can't see
world.
how a way around that. So God being imperfect has to be the final answer, or not existing at all.
Yeah. Maybe God's got better,
And the Bible does back up that idea.
Yeah. Did I not tell you the story that Roger Forster once told? And it's an apocryphal story of a young girl who was reading the story of the flood. And the young girl, it's probably apocryphal, and the young girl was having either story read to her or read the story, and said, "Oh, that's awful." And her way of making sense with it, it said, "That's before God became a Christian." And that little innocent kind of childlike mindset was funny but profound.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, this was God before he sort of learned a bit better. I won't wipe everyone off just like that, I thought there's a lot to that little innocent statement, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
I want to finish off with what I take as an implication of this idea that God isn't perfect.
Yeah.
And that is, it knocks away this maximally great idea that people like to even define God as sort of maximally great in moral qualities as well as other qualities. And if you say he's not maximally great, it does cause you philosophical problems, because you've then got to explain and describe how God is less than perfect and how that makes sense. And people love talking about the simplicity of God, which you can get from he's just maximally everything. So it's very simple. Not God is simple in terms of there's nothing much to him and he's a bit dim. But God is simple in terms of simple to describe as maximally great.
And I think also doesn't have parts. I think that's he is sort of one perfect whole and can't be divided into various. He's not a composite. I suppose this is probably what they're getting at.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not talking about that aspect of simplicity, more the explanation kind of simplicity. Because I'm going to switch now to Occam, who was famous for his idea that simple things are always the best explanations. So you only have a complex explanation when a simple one falls down, or if you've got two explanations, one is simple and one's sort of a bit ad hoc, you will favor the simple one, all things being equal. Is that a fair summary of the Occam approach?
Yes, it is. It's often put into a short phrase, which apparently he never used, but it is quite a useful way of summarizing his approach, which is entities are not needlessly to be multiplied. So you always try and be parsimonious with your explanation. I mean, I think that's worth raising the caveat that this is not a rule of logic. It's no logical law that you have to be simple. It's what's called a heuristic device. And a heuristic device is a way of approaching problems to, I wish I'd looked up heuristic device before I sort of painted myself into this corner of talking about it. But basically, it's a way of reasoning, a sort of way of reasoning that makes it easier to reason. And it could be that a more complex explanation is true, but I think we can all just kind of instinctively feel that if you don't need to add things, why would you? It's always going to be the more rational approach to start with as the simplest explanation that suggests, that posits the fewest entities, and is the most straightforward explanation. And it's only if you then find evidence that doesn't fit with that means you need to increase the complexity of your explanation, that you would then go there.
Yeah. So I think that does fit with what I'm saying. So if you could say God is maximally great in everything, and that's the, what's the explanation for everything? What's the, why are we here? What's it all about? Oh, well, there's a God behind it. Well, what's this God like? Oh, he's maximally great in everything. So it's all kept very simple. But then you say, well, no, we now realize that this God can't be maximally great. He's imperfect. So why is he imperfect? And in what degree is he imperfect? In what aspect of him is perfect? And which bits are imperfect? So it's all got very complicated quite quickly. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
On the flip side of this, just before we do sort of wrap up, I think we may have touched into this before about the sadness, or I call the sadness of the perfect God, because traditionally speaking, there's a lot of things that God can't do like humans can do, and there's a sadness to it. Like, he couldn't experience watching a football game and not knowing who's going to win and feeling the excitement of, would it be this way or that way, and he couldn't, there's a lot of things that the excitement of learning something new. I'm going to study this and I'm going to know a lot more than I did before, and it's like, no, it already. No, I know the end already. I mean, it sucks that if watching a film is enjoyable, because if you've not seen it before, you've taken through a story in which you're surprised and you have the jump here and the excitement there. God can do none of that. So I feel sad for him.
Yeah, it's boring.
It's boring. It's like a static nothingness of almighty.
Being unchangeable is
unchangeable. Everything is just done. It's just a static rock. So I feel that the full view of God is like a rock that cannot move,
God can't become bored because he's always static, so he can't become bored.
But it can't. Can he do? This is why open theists have a field day. Can he do anything when he's just a fixed rock? Where does the action come from? It's already known. It's already ordained in some cases. So it's just like, roll the tape. Roll the tape. I know it all. So so the excitement that we get in our puny finite human lives is something that he cannot do, unless people want to go to the incarnation and say, well, Jesus experienced that side of things for 3 years, maybe. And so but then back up to the divine Godhead again, and it's now to static rockness.
Yes.
So it's
like the Queen famously talking about her memories of VE Day, the actual VE Day itself, when she pulled the peak down on her Wren uniform and snuck into the crowds and no one knew who she was, and she said it was the most amazing day of my life, sort of thing. And she could experience things.
Yes, she managed to escape from that gilded cage for a little while.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, that's perspective on that. Yeah. I always used to worry. Again, it's one of my teenager things, that God knows everything and everything is always there and always in his mind, and yet he was supposed to says, "I remember your sins no more." And I'm thinking, okay. So do you remember them or not? Again, about the biblical text and the God that we talk about. Well, of course he remembers them, but he says he remembers them no more in another way. Of course, that's what's done, isn't it? But anyway, so we can go round and round and round on this.
We've gone around and around enough.
Yeah, that was the perfect show. I have been the perfect host. We will now do the perfect ending.
Okay, perfect endings. And all right, it's goodbye from me.
Yes. And it's goodbye from me.
Well, it's like the two Ronnies over here for anybody in America. It was a classic series.
This is certainly not perfect.
This is that's right. Yeah, it's good.
Well, on the other hand, as we've been discussing, the perfect hosts can make the imperfect show. Like God, the perfect God made the imperfect world, didn't he?
And to end on that British show, I'd say it's good night from me, and it's
good night from him.
That's right. Okay, until next time.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.